Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Alwood, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening again?
Yeah, my name is Ed Alwood, and I am a former journalist, former correspondent with CNN, then earned a PhD at University of North Carolina and began teaching. And so this year I've been teaching for 24 years, and I currently teach in the journalism program at the University of Maryland.
Can I ask, when we talk about certain subjects you've covered, which do you find that really sparks up your interest?
Well, I'm really surprised at what sparked up because later in my career, well, I'd say halfway in my career, I specialized in financial reporting. That's especially interesting in Washington because I got to cover various committees of Congress with taxes and that sort of thing. I got to cover the Federal Reserve and some very notable people there. Paul Volcker, I got to meet and interview, who is in the history books for sure. So what I did was I tried to apply meaningful video to explain complicated economic policies and economic news. And I found it very enjoyable, to my surprise, because I'm not a money cruncher. But I didn't approach it as a lot of money because that would just have confused a lot of people. I approached it more as trying to make sense of what was going on.
When we talk about making sense of what's going on, can you give me one of the difficult, maybe problems that you would face trying to educate? Are you trying to educate people like myself, or are you trying to educate more on just the policies and terms so people can understand them? Because I always hear that even the politicians don't really understand half of the bills that get passed.
Well, they don't, because those bills are very long and very complicated. If you break them down, it's much easier to digest them. But I learned a lot about interest rates because when I was reporting here in Washington for Channel 5, Paul Volcker raised the interest rate to 17 or 18%. And of course, that was having quite an effect on the economy and on the public. And there were reasons for it, and there were very good reasons. And there were reasons we had to go through a painful process. That's not unlike where we are today, but fortunately, they haven't had to raise them as high. But when the Fed started raising the rates, I've lost track, 2 years, 3 years ago, there was a lot of teeth gnashing at that time. And there always is when rates are raised, but there are reasons. And the whole idea of the money supply and how they measure the money supply and the effect it has under monetarism of regulating our economy is great. To touch on one thing, we all talk about inflation being, oh, that's horrible, what a horrible, horrible thing. Inflation's eating me up. Inflation's terrible. And then we'll turn around and we'll say, yeah, I want to raise this year. Well, that's inflation. And we'll say, yeah, I want my value of my home to go up. That's inflation. So it's not that we're all against inflation. We're against higher prices for us, but we love getting a higher salary and more money for our home.
But does that not turn into a snake biting its own tail? I mean, if we eventually see prices go up and then we all get raises, let's say minimum wage, I think in the first of this year, everything went up to $15. Most states do $15 for minimum wage now. I would have to think that, I mean, yeah, that helps balance out how much people are paying for groceries and stuff, but it's already pretty difficult. And I think it's a communication problem. We don't necessarily understand, like you mentioned, understanding more about inflation and what that kind of entails. A lot of people don't see that. They just see what they're buying is not the same price it used to be.
Yeah, but what you're pointing out is the complication for the Fed, because yes, the Fed wants people to make more money in terms of a minimum wage. And the Fed wants, especially elderly people, to have a savings account in the value of their home. But they don't want inflation to go so out of control that Nobody can afford anything. So that's the fine line they walk. And that's the interesting thing about sitting in their meetings, listening to them discuss this and hearing the different points of view and then their vote.
Did you have any problems with any viewpoints of any specific individuals? You don't have to say names, but maybe it was just the way that they were thinking. Is it a class issue? Would it be based on, I mean, I don't know if your background comes from, I would be lower class, maybe lower middle class if there is a middle class. But I'm curious if there's more of a voice of the people that are involved in some of these meetings compared to people that might be a little bit disconnected.
Yeah, I didn't have any problem with it. And I felt that people's voices were represented. And it's not just voices at the table, but it's also the numbers they crunch, the statistics that they go to all sorts of lengths to gather to try to measure. It's like a doctor taking a temperature of a patient. And I found them very serious and I respected them quite a lot.
So how did you end up switching over to journalism and focusing more about communications with media?
Well, I was always headed toward journalism, even in grammar school. Uh, I was interested in journalism, and I just watched, I don't know if you've seen it, I just watched the movie Rustin
I haven't even heard
about
that.
Barrett Rustin, who was the architect of the March on Washington.
Okay.
And I think I mentioned to you last time, my town that I grew up in, my hometown, excuse me, was Albany, Georgia, which became a target city of the civil rights movement back in the early 60s. And I was a kid of about 12 years old and had nothing to do in the summer. So I would go in and watch the demonstrators downtown in Albany, and it brought national media in. So I watched the media do their jobs, and I think that's where I got the bug to go into journalism. But this movie even specifically mentions once Albany, Georgia, and that's the role it played. And that movie for me brought back a lot of memories of as a kid watching the civil rights movement unfold in Georgia.
What are your thoughts on the counterculture movement? It was kind of like an alternative form, but very popularized back then of a form of media.
Yeah, and did some very interesting things. And the anti-war movement certainly had their own newspapers, the African American newspapers. Uh, and it was interesting to see, talking about a division. There was much more of a division about the news coverage back then than there about the the civil rights movement than anything to do with the economy.
Can I ask, because you cover one area, but it's about the Cold War and the press. Could you give me a breakdown of your understanding of the Cold War and the press? I have a fascination for it only because it seems like the 60s and 70s. Maybe I was just born in the wrong generation. I know people toss that out a lot, but looking back at it, I find it so fascinating. But also the fact that a lot of this information that we know about that time period, at least some background events that were going on, were explained back then. But a lot of that information came out later, 10, 15 years later, about what was really going on.
Well, it was essentially a diplomatic chess game, and everyone involved knew it was a chess game. But that's how uh, international affairs, part of how international affairs were conducted. But the Cold War was a non-fighting war, and it was more of a war of information. And it wasn't just stealing secrets and passing around secrets, which certainly involves information, but it was also even public information and a battle for public opinion. And so the Soviets, for instance, were trying to find a soft spot in America's heart. Uh, and America was trying to find a soft spot in the Soviets' heart, so to speak, with public opinion. But also there was the spying that was going on, which makes it a tremendously dramatic period of time. There's a thumbnail. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what would you say would be the most effective form of press back then? I mean, would you mention like the newspapers? I mean, voices like Walter Cronkite. It seems like there's a lot more individual characters I would say that caused people to connect with. I think that's what made Walter Cronkite so prominent was the fact that he kind of had a more of an emotional response than a lot of the stuff that was getting displayed back then.
Well, that's true. And that was a big part of the Cold War. And that was the Vietnam War, which was a hot war rather than exactly a Cold War, but the two kind of exist simultaneously. Um, for people today, young people especially, it's difficult to imagine what media was like back in that era because today there's so much media and so much to choose from. But back then, there were essentially three major TV networks. And in most towns, there was one or two local newspapers. And for information on Vietnam and that sort of thing, a local newspaper in a small town in Iowa or any small town couldn't send a reporter to Vietnam. So the papers relied on the Associated Press. And the Associated Press goes back to the telegraph days, actually. But the Associated Press, from its inception, knew that it had to supply news to papers of all stripes, papers that were editorially conservative and editorially liberal. So the Associated Press invented the idea of down the middle of the road, non-sensational, non-biased, objective news. And by objective, what we mean by that is fairly sourcing information, trying to tell more than one side of a story, and being very, very careful with adjectives. So during that era that you're talking about, there were very few outlets. Therefore, much of the nation turned to those outlets, which gave them a lot of power in being able to supply information. And coupled with that, so to a certain degree, power to influence opinion. Now, I'm not saying that CBS, NBC, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post were trying to opinionate the nation because they wanted readers, very much like the Associated Press wanted subscribers, of every political leaning. Because the more readers they would have, the more they could charge for ads, the more money they could make. So their goal really was not to inform people, but not to offend them. And yes, the papers did carry the U.S. foreign policy line, but that's not necessarily because they felt that that was a better argument than the Soviets had or the Vietnamese had. It was because that was the line that our government was putting out, and we elect our government. So we as voters needed to know what our government was doing, what policy it was carrying out, and how it was carrying it out. But the other part of it is that newspapers walk a fine line too, and that they don't want to offend the readers, and they want to find a way to inform them, even inform them of information the public doesn't agree with, but in a way that doesn't offend them and drive them away, because the media, all of them, are businesses. Unless you look at something like NPR or public broadcasting, they're not a business in the same way, but still, they have to be able to appeal to donors. So you don't want to offend your donors.
Is it better to have an establishment or media source that's funded by the government or an institution, or better to have it funded by donors?
Well, that's debated now, even more than ever, wondering if the route to go in the future for better, more reliable news coverage, wondering if the route to go is not that nonprofit route. There are pluses and minuses for both. But I think many people would agree that the editorial standards in PBS are very, very, very high. And I have not seen them accused of waffling to be able to woo a donor. It's just the potential is there, but I haven't seen that happen. So I don't know. We'll see. We may see in the future, may see soon, whether nonprofit journalism is preferable over what we have today.
What about the consensus amongst the American public? I mean, did you find that it was a lot more easier back in the day because with all these just basic news outlets compared to the massive amount we have today, I would feel like a lot of people would be amongst the same opinion. I mean, it's kind of like if we use the example of like the Pentagon Papers. Everyone kind of had doubts about what was going on in Vietnam, and then they were only confirmed when these papers were leaked to the press. I mean, good on Ellsberg for releasing those, but also good on the media for stepping up and accepting that and publishing that, because I hadn't seen really any criticism of the government before. I mean, besides an article here about a director or something like that, but that was a turning point in the country that really shaped a lot of events like Watergate and things that followed after.
I think one of the big things that separates that era from this era is by having fewer media, big media back then, there was sort of a level playing field among the public understanding of what was happening. Not that they all agree on it, but an understanding. For instance, let's go back to the colonial era when there were very few newspapers, and the newspapers that we had were all partisan press. They were all connected with a political party. And the way people understood what was happening was they would go to the town square and they would have discussions. They'd sit on benches. They would have a discussion, and they all had an understanding of the basic facts, and then had a discussion about their opinions about the facts. Well, on that public square, there was limited source of information, so it was easy to have a level playing field. Well, then when you got to the electronic era and the penny press era, there was still a few compared to today media outlets. So you again had pretty general understanding from coast to coast of the facts of what was happening, such as the Pentagon Papers, such as the Vietnam War. But today, it's so fractured, and there's so many different sources, and it's so hard to know which source to trust, and which source is expressing facts versus opinion, that we've had a breakdown in the national understanding of what the discussion is all about. So that's made it much, much more complicated.
Can I ask how you feel about political biases in press reporting? It seems like back then, at least from what I'm looking at from the 60s and 70s, I mean, it wasn't as clear. I mean, maybe you could tell back then if you lived and got to experience it, but it's so apparent to me now when I look at different media reporting and journalism that you can easily point out a political bias, whether they're Republican, Democrat, whatever side that fits your narrative, you can choose. And it makes it very difficult to get on a consensus of things. So you see events differently.
Yeah, but what do you use to see that bias?
Probably your own bias.
No. I mean, as you see the news, read the news, what is it in the news that triggers you to feel that there is a bias?
Typically, when they really keep hammering the other party as much, when they start going this right, like in one sentence, they'll say the word right wing 15 times. And then in one sentence on the other network, they'll say the word leftist 15 times. Where I'm like, well, they're obviously not on that side. They're kind of just poking a jab at the other one, which makes it the whole media reporting in general where you lose the essence of the story.
Yeah. The thing is, I'm not sure. I have, well, the Republican Party would not argue with them being called conservative. The Democratic Party would not argue with being called liberal, except that liberal's been given such a bad name, bad rap, the word. So there are labels that the parties do subscribe to. And so it's perfectly acceptable for the media to use those labels. The other thing is when a candidate criticizes another candidate, and the media quotes that candidate's criticism, that doesn't mean the media agrees with it. That doesn't mean that they've chosen it just because of those words. It means that we as voters need to understand that Ted Cruz may be using a certain word to describe his opponent. That doesn't point to a bias of the media. So we're in an awkward position of trying to communicate and not just spew out sterile facts, but communicate in a way that's interesting, or people are going to tune out and say, that's boring. I'm not going to, especially today, because so much is connected to entertainment. And I wonder sometimes if the news organizations have fallen prey to the entertainment side rather than the informing side. And I think that plays to what you're saying too. If I see a bias, it's a bias toward trying too hard to entertain people and not as hard to inform them.
That's very, very true. It's kind of like radio. It's like a dying art. I mean, you can still listen to radio in your car, but with all these different services and our devices now, it kind of eliminated a lot of an avenue for radio.
Well, there is, and I copied this from somebody, but I used it in one of my classes, and that is, I took a clip from the presidential debates, and you pick the debate. It could be the Trump Clinton debate, or it could be the Nikki Haley debate that just happened. DeSantis just happened. But I would pick a clip of them scoring a point and then edit it next to a professional wrestling match, throwing the other wrestler on the floor of the riser, and then go back to another clip from the debate, and then another clip from the wrestling match, and you get the point. It's the same type of atmosphere at the debates now that we have with professional wrestling matches, and it's apparently it's quite to a large degree stirring up the same type of emotion in people who watch.
I would say we never had that back in the day, but then I have to remember the William F. Buckley debate where he says the funniest thing to me, which is, I'll sock you so hard you'll stay plastered. I've never heard of that in my entire life, but someone needs to put that on a shirt. But it was just that debate that they had where obviously two people kind of lost their cool and you saw the gotcha politics. And that's everything that we see today is everything is like that. Not maybe a remark or a threat like that, but it's always a gotcha politic type jab at the other candidate. Like my candidate doesn't know what he's talking about because he has whatever, insert whatever here. And somehow we feed off that. And it was interesting for me to watch those old clips back then because I'm like, hey, it's not that different. But then there's so much of that culture that was extremely different about the press that is not is unmatchable today. Where I wonder where it went wrong. I mean, do you think it was like an event that we had in our history that just altered the course? Do you think it's the 24-hour news cycle?
Oh, no. Well, let me say one thing before I go to that, and that is some of the jabs could even be very polite jabs. And I'm thinking of the time that Ronald Reagan said, well, there you go again. And
Yeah.
and nobody's going to ignore that. And the press knows that, and they're going to quote it. Now, that doesn't mean they're biased toward Reagan or even biased against Jimmy Carter. But it is a jab. And I don't know, this may be my own bias, but I think a lot of people go to a stock car race to wait on a crash.
I think that's pretty true.
And the same thing happens with the debates now. People are going to wait on a crash. You asked about the increase in it, and I think it's because of competitiveness. Um, I mean, for instance, let's say that Fox News is, I'll pick them because they're carrying so many of the debates. Fox News is competing with other outlets such as BuzzFeed, or even a very conservative online media. So because of that type of competition, they need those wrecks on the stock car racing track to hold on to people. I would imagine that the executives of the networks are just sitting and clapping every time there's a jab like
Yeah.
that. But the research shows that those types of things turn the audience into cynics, and that's what we're seeing.
Have you ever looked at, like, from a historical standpoint, any major events and seen when maybe there was a difference in the time, like when something shifted? Like at Watergate, for instance, I think was a big watershed moment for a lot of people. But there's plenty of other examples you could probably point at through history that had some type of impact that were largely affected. I mean, I would consider an example that wasn't known for the longest time, but it was the use of the intelligence services using journalists. Um, in various different areas, whether it was overseas that was exposed by the church committee and even domestically as well too. I mean, it brings up a big question for me ethically about press freedoms. But I don't know how long that had been going on for, and I don't know if there was any other events that could even match that. I'm sure there had to be.
Well, the using journalist part is an interesting example because the only way we know about that is William Colby was testifying, the head of the CIA was testifying, and gave his what's been called the dirty laundry talk uh, on the Hill. And so we know the information you just mentioned, but we don't know very many details. And in my research and dealing with some journalists that I suspected were on the CIA payroll, I've tried to get their files from the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act, and I can't. One in particular, I can get everything but one page from his files. And so I thought that maybe I could link up with the power of a US senator. So I went to a senator and explained what I was doing, and he requested the file, and they won't give it to him. So there you are.
When did you become aware of that though? Because I just, like I said, since the last time we talked, I've been doing a deep dive into the church committee and other areas of the 60s and 70s. Right now, I'm focused largely on Nixon's uh, short time in office, or 5 years. But I'm curious, were you able to really capture it earlier? I don't know when the records essentially came available. I'm guessing a little bit after Watergate when the church committee was out there. But William Colby, that was a great example. I mean, what are your thoughts on government having that power to influence journalists? I mean, we know they blocked some literature books as well too with writers.
Well, in this case in particular, it takes two to tango. And it wasn't just the CIA wanting to use journalists, it was journalists wanting to do something in a patriotic way. Um, but the irony there, and I may have mentioned this to you last time, is the way we practice journalism in this country and a lot of countries is if you're a reporter and you're doing a story on uh, the Pentagon deciding to use uh, a landing field near your home for drones, you're a local reporter and you're going to do a story about, hey, wow, the Defense Department's going to use local airstrip for drones. In fact, it may mean more jobs for our area, it may be more income, et cetera, et cetera. So the way you cover the story is you go to the Pentagon and you interview him. And then you go to the local mayor and you interview local mayor, and you probably tell the mayor something that was said at the Pentagon to get his reaction to it. Well, that's fine in our country, and we accept that as a normal way of doing journalism. But in other countries, such as the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during the Cold War era, that can easily be seen as espionage. Because what you're doing as a journalist is taking information you were given that's government information and giving the information to someone else. And so the idea of spying in that era, you have to look at the definition of spying very carefully and see if it's the definition used in the West or definition used in the East. And that makes it especially complicated. Um, the question that you raise is journalists who accepted money from the CIA in exchange for information like that, or maybe the CIA arranged for the journalist to, under the cover of being a journalist, to be able to interview someone in a foreign capital, for instance, and then bring the information back. That's the questionable and ethically questionable activity. And that's what I wanted to find out, because one journalist in particular that I researched was accused of being a spy, and the CIA wouldn't. That's one of the ones I requested information on. They've never given information about it
Why were you concerned, or were you thinking he was a spy?
because the communist government of Czechoslovakia had arrested him on espionage charges and put him in prison. And I wanted to know, as a researcher in journalism, whether he was just doing his regular job as a journalist, for instance, interviewing people, or if he was on the payroll of the CIA.
Did you ever feel like it was a bit of paranoia at the time? I mean, with that fear of communism that was out there, it seemed like there's a lot of propaganda that was getting tossed in the mix, whether it was with the film industry or whether it was with media, from both sides. Not just nobody's not at fault here, but when you really examine it, I mean, the paranoia, people are hiding under their desks thinking that was going to stop a nuclear bomb from going off. Like that's a disconnected feeling than what my generation has to deal with today.
Well, an almost foolproof way of motivating people is to scare them. And I think I mentioned this last time too. Advertisers know this. And all I have to do is scare you into thinking your deodorant hasn't worked today to get you to use a more powerful deodorant. Or to tell you that your teeth look really yellow, that would scare you because you don't want people looking at you seeing yellow teeth. And that will help prompt you to use a more powerful toothpaste. And so the same thing has been true in the McCarthy era. And that is, if you want to, for instance, get votes, scare people into thinking we're not safe. And I, as a candidate, have a plan to make us safer. So that's a lot of what propelled the McCarthy era, and Joe McCarthy in particular. And one of the architects of that was Roy Cohn, his lawyer, who would carry his water on that. Now, that's not unlike some of the tactics we've seen under Donald Trump. And he's quite aware that in order to scare, but well, I'll give you an example. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with his claim, but one of his claims was that we were under attack because of the immigration issue. And that's one of the ways he sold the idea of the wall, was to scare people to believe that without that wall, we were not safe. And that may or may not have been true, but the tactic works, and it's a tactic that he copied really from the McCarthy era and from Roy Cohn. He had been quoted once of saying, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" He's aware of this.
What did the McCarthy era really impact? I mean, I know they were influenced in film as well too. I mean, they pumped out propaganda films really. I mean, the Red Scare, and then there was like a second Red Scare that started happening, but there was a lot of conditions and restrictions on certain industries like the press and like Hollywood that were adjusted because of McCarthyism.
Well, he went after anybody who was seen as an enemy, and that means anybody who was opposed to him, which is also a parallel with the Trump era. So McCarthy was against anybody who spoke badly of him, for instance. So he went after government employees big time and accusing them of being communist. He went after State Department, claimed that they had allowed communist books in libraries in embassies in other countries. So he got them fired. He went against people in labor unions, claiming that they were banding together to cripple the country in case we were attacked. Went against teachers. Who else can I think of? And you're right, Hollywood was a very big one, but that got a lot of publicity because those were big names. I mean, McCarthy going after a labor group wasn't going to get as much publicity as McCarthy going after a Hollywood star. And people could relate to that even more.
When I mentioned independent writers earlier, there are some things like I think it's Los Angeles Times and Washington Post, New York Post, that ended up picking up like I'm coming across things in the archives that are old, just clippings from headlines and stories about writers, specifically in the JFK stuff. But there's a lot of stuff that even talked about with like Carl Bernstein, I might be saying his name wrong, but with Mark Felt. I don't believe Mark Felt was just one person. I think it had to be multiple people. I think that's a lot of people share that same value. But that was the first time that a source was ever confirmed off one, not with a backup source. Usually you need 2 points of identification or verification there, but we only had one with that one. And it seemed like everybody agreed. And to me, it was just interesting because you saw a lot of independent writers and authors that didn't share the same popular view of the mainstream media or the same agreement with the government that were getting articles published, which makes me hard to criticize those magazines or newspapers because usually we can say all news is captured. I like that angle, but I'm coming across things where I'm like, wow, that was reported on. Wow, the government kept a document of a headline of this article about J. Edgar Hoover. Whether they were keeping it because nobody talked trash on the director, but it was just interesting to see media kind of throw a jab or highlight an author that had a different view than the mainstream.
Um,
I'm not a libertarian, but damn if I don't judge our government a little bit. I've seen too many bad things they've done in the past.
oh yeah, I mean, and the Vietnam War, especially with my age group, is a shining example. But the New York Times, back when it was in its young days, uh, Adolf Ochs, who bought it, an immigrant from Germany, and bought it. And one thing he instituted that became a standard was the idea that news would be on the news pages and opinion would be on the op-ed pages. And so on the op-ed pages, you have the newspaper's editorial, and then you have guest columnists. And yes, the newspapers tend to take a certain lean on their editorial pages, whether it's conservative or liberal or usually there's a distinctive lean. And then they invite columnists to not only echo that lean, but to have the other side. For instance, George Will being in the Washington Post on the op-ed page. And often they have a conservative writer, and I think the Wall Street Journal even will have from time to time a liberal writer to bring out the other side. So I think they make an effort there. But broadcasting has almost never had the same type of thing. The closest broadcasting came was the point counterpoint types of things, face-off kind of things that 60 Minutes would have at the end of their show, for instance. And then that CNN brought along with, I forgot the name of the show, with Pat Buchanan and some of those people. So I think there is an effort there. But when you sit in the newsrooms and when you own a paper or an outlet of any kind, even online outlet now, you have to ask, what do people want to know about? What subjects do they want to know about? And when there's a subject that all of a sudden there's a very, very radical view, responsible papers want to know, is that radical view dependable or not? Or are we going to shine light on the radical view and then find out in a month or two that this was a lie, which is going to embarrass us and drive off people relying on us for news? So this is the fine line that they walk.
But also, what is the political ramifications for reporting on something that might be true, but that might not be the best thing to be reporting on, whether you're going to get scrutiny from the people you're maybe telling the story about?
Yeah, but I have found uh, we
Everyone
owners,
crapped on Nixon, but I would be afraid of Spiro Agnew. Apparently, he was a bulldog.
yeah, he was. But people have people who have media have an instinct about them that they like a good controversy that stirs debate and brings more readers, more viewers.
What, when it comes to the history of broadcasting, who had the biggest impact? I mean, president-wise. Obviously, every president has made statements. I'm just curious if you have any in mind that you could think of. It doesn't have to necessarily be just one, but learning more about Kennedy. I mean, I think a lot of what boosted Kennedy's votes was also the fact that he did a lot of television appearances, media appearances. He was partially afraid that the press was going to clip things that he said and take it out of place. So he believed that going on and speaking in front of a public for however long those television segments were a great way to connect. And I think there is evidence to support that those did boost up some of his results in the polls.
Um, we have to go back to the beginning with FDR. And of course, he was so smart to begin those fireside chats. But the really interesting thing is, and I don't off the top of my head know the number, but he didn't do a lot of those. He only did, I don't know if it was 12 or something, a relatively small number. And that was key because that way people didn't get tired of hearing him. He didn't get to be kind of run of the mill. And that's where Trump made his big mistake with Twitter. He did it too much and it became run of the mill. People began to ignore it. In the beginning, no one ignored it. And then he did it so much that they ignored it. So anyway, FDR was very media savvy with radio. And then Truman became media savvy and television came along. And Truman knew how to make speeches that worked really well on television. And the TV, the first convention they carried was with Truman's convention in Philadelphia. Eisenhower came along, and Eisenhower, being a Republican, had a lot of friends who were in the advertising and PR industry. And Rosser Reeves was one of them, and he's the one who took Eisenhower under his wing and developed TV commercials with Eisenhower. And what Reeves did was he took a camera crew to Fifth Avenue in New York and stopped people along the street and asked them, what question would you ask Eisenhower? And on film, they asked the question. And then he went to Eisenhower and had Eisenhower film an answer to each of those and intercut them. And it was very interesting because you can see how crafty it was, because all of the people who asked a question looked up and Eisenhower always looked down in giving the answers. So when they were edited together, you had this kind of subliminal message that he was on high and they were lower. Now, the interesting thing about Kennedy is that unlike Eisenhower, Kennedy was not afraid to go live on television. Everything with Eisenhower was recorded and everything was edited. But Kennedy broke through with the live press conferences and live television. And that opened the way, of course, for Nixon to also do that.
Yeah, through his presidency, Kennedy did 63 of those live press conference things.
Yeah. And then it has been said that those debates with Kennedy, which were certainly live, influenced the outcome of the debate because Kennedy came across as very self-confident and younger, and Nixon less self-confident and circles under his eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And that played a huge role. So
Have you seen the Nixon and Kennedy debate? I mean, it's pretty clear to me watching visually that just Kennedy looks more comprised and more put together. I heard this from a Nixon historian. They said that when there was a poll that came out that interviewed people and took a poll result based on people that watched the debates versus people that listened to them. And the people that listened to them said that Nixon won. Now there was an issue with the poll just because they had a certain thing added in. They didn't account for something else from what I was told. But it was because you couldn't see the sweat on Nixon's upper lip. You couldn't see that he didn't want any makeup on him. He was kind of rushing. He was a little bit under the weather, which I think visually when you see that on TV, Nixon kind of looks like he's falling apart a little bit during the debates. Now, I am a Kennedy fan. I think what Kennedy had to say was amazing, but I'm also trying to take account for the times back then, and that was revolutionary thinking. A lot of people were more about how are we going to hit the communists, and Nixon's debate was full of that. But I think it was just interesting. I don't know if you believe that more people thought Nixon won if they listened to the radio compared to if they watched television, but I think it's another medium.
right, and I was going to bring up radio. My understanding is that the people who listened to it on radio and were polled had the opposite reaction. They leaned toward Nixon rather than Kennedy. So I think those two polls are I think the reason people give the TV such credit for such potency.
Have you come across any presidents that made remarks about their own institutions to the media? I can only think of really one example, and it might have changed my way I view him as a president. I don't think we really talk about him that much, but Harry Truman. He made some interesting statements to the press throughout his presidency that I just thought was pretty hilarious because we don't really, I mean, I believe like a military industrial complex, like Eisenhower said, but when Dag Hammarskjöld died, he said something that was very interesting. And if you know Dag Hammarskjöld's death, it's been investigated well over 10 times. And I think the most recent one was in 2015 by the UN, where they had to re-examine it again. But Truman said something to the press, and he said he was on the verge of doing something when they killed him. Notice how I said they killed him. And the press never followed up with anything on that. And I just thought, what did you know, man? Like looking back to a historical lens, I'm like, what is that supposed to mean? It's like Hale Boggs calling out Hoover, and Associated Press recorded it. You can watch it on YouTube. It's so eerie. It's like, what do these guys know about the behind the scenes stuff?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine when Truman said that. I can't imagine a reporter not following up saying, "What did you mean by that?"
Oh, I mean, that's what happened. Nobody asked him any more questions on that. They moved on to the next thing, which is just interesting in its own because then he even gave an op-ed piece to the Washington Post, I want to say it was, about the Central Intelligence Agency. And he said that he believes that from its original start, its creation from the OSS, that they've lost base to what their original mission was. And then no, like we don't ever hear about it. It's in the archives. I came across it, but I didn't know Truman was like that as a president. I thought more of those people were people like Kennedy that I think we all publicly know that he made statements against certain organizations. And then maybe Nixon, because he was going a little bit crazy towards the end. But we don't ever hear about Truman.
Sure,
Have you ever
sure.
had a president that you had to change your view on just from looking deeper into their presidency?
No. Well, I guess one example is, and I covered Carter in his last couple of years here, and of course his defeat was laid in the idea of that attempt to free the hostages in Iran falling short and the soldiers getting killed. And he took a lot of flack for that and lost the election. But in more recent years, I have had an awakening of Carter's record, which was quite outstanding, and I think he will be remembered better in history than he has during his lifetime, frankly.
He's still alive, isn't he?
Yes,
Yeah, but do you think his popularity is going to go up once he passes away?
I think. Well, I'm not sure I'd call it popularity. I think recognition of his contribution will be closer to fact than it is now.
Well, what's the public memory of him right now compared to what you've learned that might be a little bit different? I only know a few things about Carter just when it comes to like JFK files and some weird thing about Jonestown where Harvey Milk had written a letter to Jimmy Carter about that. And I was like, look, conspiracies aside, that's just a weird time period, man. There was a lot of stuff that was going on where I was like, I don't know how anybody, whether it's different presidents or not, could even manage functioning with the amount of counterculture and also revolution stuff that was going on.
Well, my feeling is that the public looks at him mostly as an ineffective president. And I think that's very unfair because he comes from, well, the same area of Georgia I come from. Um, and if you have a president who doesn't have a huge ego, they're probably going to come across as being ineffective because we've gotten so used to the grandstanding of you name it, Nixon or to a certain extent Ford when he pardoned people with the Watergate, uh, and certainly with Trump. Uh, if we don't see grandstanding by the president, we think they're ineffective, and I think that's where Carter falls. I don't think he was the type to uh, holler from left to right, seashore to seashore, hollered at people about how important he was.
What about criticism of the press? Do you think that has a important role to play in the way that media is depicted or media does its reporting?
Sure. Um, and the press gets voted on every day, unlike a presidential candidate, almost every hour. Uh, people vote with the knobs they turn on the TV or the radio or the buttons they push on the computer. Um, and yeah, the press needs to listen to the criticism and weigh it and take it seriously. And if they can rectify a situation, fine. Um, but I think a lot of people don't understand how the press operates and that there are limitations. For instance, I think I mentioned to you last time, we talk about bias in the press as one thing, and that is political bias. But there are all kinds of things that cause bias. Um, and it could be the fact that there was no camera at a certain place when something happened. Like today, I think I mentioned this last time. We've got snow falling here in DC, and it will be at the tops of the local newscast, and it may even be on national news tonight. We're going to get between 2 and 3 inches. Now, that's really not news. 2 or 3 inches of snow, who cares? But there are camera people here for the networks. There are federal workers who may have trouble getting to or from work and that type of thing. It biases the story toward DC getting 2 or 3 inches versus some other place that either got 2 or 3 inches or a lot more snow and got no coverage. So that's a bias too. Um, so there are various biases. There are also religious biases uh, that are reflected in news, depending on the type of story it is. Um, a story about a minority religious organization doing something in America, which is largely a Christian nation, probably won't get as much attention on the media as it would in a country that was a majority of that religion. So there are lots of biases, and it's impossible to cure all of them. There are going to be biases just by the nature of the fact that news is a material. It's actually a product. News is a product, and the news organizations manufacture the product.
Well, you have such extensive work with journalism and also just the history of broadcasting in general. But if we talk about how the public should be accepting media, how would you recommend going about looking at media? I mean,
Well,
I don't,
that's the hard thing now, and this is part of my course now, which is fairly new. And we also have courses in media literacy, and that is now the onus is on the consumer to ferret out what is reliable media and what is not. And it's not just media that we agree with. It needs to be media that is operated in a responsible way that will tell us both sides and will tell us information we may not want to hear. I see stories about taxes going up. I don't want to hear that, but I need to. And the reason I need to is because I voted for those people who are raising the taxes. So there's a job for me to decide if I want to return those people to office or not. So the media is informing me, a voter, to help me do my job as a voter. But it takes time to ferret out media. It takes time to do research to find out which organization is reputable. You know, I may have used this last time we talked, but there was a time when it didn't matter which bank you opened an account with. It was going to be the same thing. It was going to be a checking account. It was going to clear in a certain number of days. The fees were essentially the same across all the banks. It really didn't matter which bank you went with. And then deregulation came along in the banking industry, and some banks offered higher fees, lower fees for this and higher fees for that, et cetera. And so it became important for us as consumers to decide which bank met our needs. Well, that put more work on me and more work on you, but it's worth it. The same thing has happened with news. And to a large degree, the internet has deregulated news in that it has brought more freedom to you as a user. But as it has brought more freedom to you, it's brought more responsibility to you, uh, so that you don't want to buy some tainted product on the grocery shelf. Well, you don't want to buy a tainted product coming across as news either.
I find it difficult. I don't consider myself news or anything, but I find some historical subjects that a lot of people might not be aware of, that if you said something, you get the label conspiracy theorist on you. I'm not necessarily a conspiracy theorist. I mean, I've done damn near 1,600 of these episodes with various academics and non-academics. But like the thing I mentioned with Harry Truman, that's real. That was told to me by multiple reporters, and I got a 60-second clip on it backing it up with documentation on my YouTube about it. But also, Gerald Ford moving Kennedy's back wound up 6 inches in the final commission report that didn't come out until 20 years after the HSCA's investigation. Say that to someone, people think you're nuts. But then you get all these people. It is known. You can look that up. That will be reported on by various news outlets. But a lot of people don't know that, and saying it makes you sound conspiratorial. It's so hard because there's so much information out there. You can choose what you want to trust and choose what you don't. I'm just surprised we don't engage in the conversation anymore. I mean, it makes me wonder if back then people ever did engage in the conversation.
Yeah, well, the important thing you just said was people choose who they trust and who they don't. But so many people today are making their choices based on who they agree with and who they don't. And that's just not an informed citizenry. We have to be grown-ups. And we have to be able to listen to something we don't agree with, and not fear that it's going to influence us unless it makes sense. Not fear that we're going to be misled somewhere all of the time. But it's difficult in this environment.
Do you think we're close to a turning point in this country when it comes to media reporting? Do you think there'll ever be a change or a new direction that will get on to maybe a different track that might be necessarily better? Or do you think this is a good way that we're running?
I have no idea.
I like that answer. That's a tough question. I'm sorry to stick
Have
that on you.
so there's me not trying to fool you into thinking that I'm real smart about that. I'm not. I don't know. There are people today in those positions trying to figure out what the heck to do, and the changes are way beyond what anybody imagined. To give you, for instance, the values of the networks, which used to be mountain high, have come way down, because they don't have the influence they had. Uh, they can't monitor behavioral targeting like the internet can. So an advertiser's more likely to go to an internet advertiser than to a major network, for instance, because they get more information from the internet advertisement about what people want, how people view their product. Well, that means the network can't sell as many ads, and it means they don't have as much income because of that. And it means they can't pay as much to reporters or even actors and actresses. And so when I look at a TV schedule and I see ABC television during prime time, the 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 10 o'clock blocks are all a celebrity-based talent show, such as America's Got Talent, I know they've got a problem, because that type of show is one of the cheapest to produce as opposed to a drama show. And if you look across the spectrum today, you see so few drama shows now on the major networks. And where have they gone? They've gone to Netflix. They've gone to YouTube. They've gone to Apple TV. That's where the dramas are. And those are able to do those types of shows because they're subscription. They're not based on advertisement. So they know what their income is going to be, and they know what they can spend on making a show. I mean, it's just, to me, and Netflix, to look at, and I don't know this number, I should look it up sometime. I can't even imagine how much The Crown cost Netflix. Not only in terms of the stars and actors and actresses that they have, but the sets, the locations, the cost of it. No network can afford that now.
It's weird to see that change. Streaming services, when they first came out, everyone laughed. Like, what are you talking about,
Oh,
Netflix? And
totally.
now it's like, oh, it's a staple.
When Netflix went from disc to streaming, we all thought they were out of their minds. Um, but that's where it is today. Now, there are two problems that have come up with that. And I'm telling you all this to show you how difficult it is to make the forecast that you asked me to make. But now you can't have just one streaming service. You have to have two or three or four streaming services, which means you're going to be paying a higher and higher price for the streaming service. And at some point, you're going to pay more than you were paying for cable. And people went to streaming to get away from cable and the price of cable. So I don't know. And now they're bundling. They're trying to bundle. I have T-Mobile, and I have a plan with T-Mobile that includes Netflix. So I'm really glad to have streaming without even paying streaming amount. It's through my provider, and I think we'll see more of that. Now, what does that mean in terms of their production? I don't know in the future if they're going to be able to, and I'm talking a long time in the future, if they're going to be able to afford the costs of something like The Crown. But for now, the streaming services, Netflix, Sony, even YouTube are where the real quality programs are found.
Well, Mr. Alwood, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about these various subjects. I respect your opinion because I think you give it a really balanced approach, and it comes from years of experience and also understanding this topic. Is there a place where people can find any of your links? I know you have a website, but do you have any others, or would you just want to say your website one more time for the people out there listening?
No, I have just the website. It's Edward Alwood at uh, you can find it that way, just typing in Edward Alwood.
You're the only one around.
I'm the only it'll come up. My homepage will come up. Yeah.
Well, I'll make sure I link that in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.